Now, before I get into sort of the meat of my presentation, it's really important to give you a quick context. So that's where I'd like to start. Just a really quick overview of sort of the media landscape of the Arab world and sort of that nexus of state, culture, and music. Now, for me, a lot of my research has sort of come from this question of what it means to be Arab. It's a very fickle term. It's dynamic over geography, so it means something different in different cities and in different villages, and it's dynamic over time. So what it means to be Arab is different today than it was last year, than it was 50 years, than it was 500 years ago. So it's very much a moving target. And oftentimes it's really through cultural production that we can best sort of try and get an insight into what this really important term of Arab and what that means. And there's a quote that sort of always echoes in the back of my head when I think about this issue, and that's this: Cairo writes, Beirut publishes, and Baghdad reads. And I just love this quote for so many reasons. It shows the interconnectedness of the region, but also that it's an uneven relationship, right? So there's centers of control, there's centers of production, there's gatekeepers, there's different demographics and audiences throughout the region, and it's really that interconnectedness that helps to mediate how people come to understand what it means to be Arab, what it means to sort of be an actor in the Arabic language landscape, as well as the role of mass-mediated forms. And this is really about the 20th century. And it was in the 20th century that Egypt was able to leverage a vibrant collection of newspapers, poets, and musicians in combination with new technologies to cement itself as the premier cultural center of gravity of the Arab world. And so we're talking phonographs, radios, and the film industry. And you know, speaking to that, it's telling that throughout the region, many people understand the Egyptian dialect of Arabic, but the reverse isn't true. So that speaks to sort of the hegemony, the power of the Egyptian, specifically Cairo, media industry. Well, there's been somewhat of a decline over the last couple of decades. Egypt, for a long time, firmly held the third place in the world film global industry. You know, Bollywood, Hollywood, and then Egypt. And the premier example of this is probably the legendary singer Kulthum. She rode these new technologies, the phonograph, the film industry, and radio, to be a very important trendsetter, both artistically and politically, in the region. It's worth noting the last time that Tahrir Square saw these incredible throngs of people was at her funeral in 1975. And there's a clip from that. It's to the point where some scholars like Michael Frischkopf have argued that Kulthum's musical dominance was nearly a metaphor for state control. And Laith Ulaby has written that the culture industry in Egypt is, quote, in the business of producing not just entertainment or art, but national pedagogy. And leaders like Gamal Abdel Nasser really quickly recognized what we call today soft power, and was able to leverage this huge media industry, and specifically Kulthum, as part of statecraft. And that was important not just domestically, but regionally and internationally. And it's interesting how Kulthum sort of tied into the revolutions of her time, and is sort of a mirror to the revolutions that we're going to be talking about of our time. For instance, when Gamal Abdel Nasser overthrew King Farouk in 1952, they took Kulthum off the radio because she'd sung at a performance for King Farouk. And it's said that Gamal Abdel Nasser was very upset by this and said, you have to put Kulthum back on the radio or the people will turn against the revolution. So once again, we see this tie-up between culture, between music, and the nation state. The other example I'd say is looking, once again, relevant to the Arab Spring, we have Gaddafi. And here's a quote from an American diplomat in 1969. By 1969, Gaddafi and his friends were ready to stage their coup. Gaddafi took advantage of the 6 weeks leave he had accumulated and set the date for the takeover for March 12th. However, it turned out that the legendary singer Kulthum was scheduled to perform that night. Her concerts lasted hours. All of Libya's political and military leaders would be there all night with their families. Out of respect for Kulthum and wishing to avoid the awkwardness of arresting the leaders in front of their wives and children, Gaddafi postponed the revolution. It's kind of hard to imagine, you know, another singer or another instance in which someone of such, you know, magnitude that it would delay the revolution that would ultimately bring Muammar Gaddafi and his cadre to power. Similarly, when Gamal Abdel Nasser passed away in Egypt and was replaced by Sadat, we had an instance where Kulthum sort of fell out of favor because she didn't adequately represent the vision of what Egypt was for sort of the neoliberal policies that were being enacted at the time by Sadat, and he started to favor the singer Abdelhalim Hafez, who was seen as sort of more modern and more embodying the elements of the state. It's worth noting once again, as where we're going to be going, that in 1970 Cairo was a very different place. It was only 3 million people. It's a huge metro area now, and the policies that were enacted by Sadat in many ways set the groundwork, set the table for what we're sort of going to be seeing in 2011. So that's sort of an interesting thing. Now, Egypt is not the only center of cultural production in the Middle East, although it's probably the biggest. It's rivaled by Lebanon, specifically Beirut. And so here, once again, interestingly, we have another woman who really comes to embody and exemplify the cultural production of that country. The decades-long careers of Fayrouz and Kulthum, both of whom blurred the distinctions between classical and popular, as well as many other sort of boundaries, became important symbols on many levels and sort of became claimed by many different, ideological groups for different reasons. They became national icons, hallmarks of Arab achievements, and important Arab images of Arab women. The Arab nationalism of the mid-20th century gained its voice and power through print, film, and music. The cultural dominance of Egypt, and to a lesser extent Lebanon, helped to also develop a regional media market. So this sense that I know that you're watching the same thing I am, right? So this I know that you know that I know that you know kind of thing is a very important sense of understanding the region as a media market and sort of the political valences that come along with that. Now, as we know, the lofty aspirations of pan-Arabism didn't really sort of pan out. And that brings an updated version of that quote that I showed at the beginning of the talk, and that's this. Cairo writes, Beirut publishes, Baghdad reads, and Damascus censors. So until we get until the 1990s, it was really easy for the nation states to control and dominate the mass media landscape in their local countries. The average person, well, you might be able to get some shortwave broadcasts from the BBC Arabic Language Service or the Voice of America. You were really confined to what was being produced terrestrially, right? So just sort of the FM or the old TV channels. There's really not cable TV in the Middle East. And so this allowed the local governments to control. Now, there were the pirated cassettes of, people in Egypt or in other places, but that was much more difficult. And so the sort of broader landscape was really dominated by very droll, dull, drab, unimaginative programming at a very sort of local level. Now, all this changed in the 1990s, and we had two new digital technologies. The first is the internet. But the internet has had relatively uneven impacts across the Middle East, and it's only more recently that the penetration rates are really getting high. But the other one has been so critical as satellite TV. Now, satellite TV isn't so important in this country. We have so many different options and everything, but there, it was this new technology. You could beam in this satellite signal that crossed the boundaries of nation states and opened up this whole new panoply of options. Now, Al Jazeera is probably the most famous example of that. Al Jazeera, of course, located in Doha, Qatar. And similar news shows sort of came into that space, and that's one of the sort of famous things. But right alongside it are MTV-style music video clip stations. If you go to a cafe in the Middle East today, almost always that cafe is either playing Al Jazeera-style news shows or MTV-style music video clip shows. That's really what it is. So even if you weren't wealthy enough to afford your own TV, as long as you afford a cup of tea and go to the cafe, you had access to this whole new input, this whole new set of stations and inputs from these different new media companies. Already by the year 2000, most of the Gulf states had satellite penetration rates in the 70, 80, 90% range. So it happened very quickly, the adoption. Now, while Cairo and Beirut for a long time were these premier centers of cultural production in the Middle East, these new technologies have really allowed for a new rival to emerge, and that's really based in the Gulf. And that sort of started in 1996. And so I'll be coming back to this point after we talk about the Arab Spring a little more, but I just want to keep it in the back of our minds. So Al Jazeera is located in the Gulf, as well as Rotana, which is the biggest probably entertainment conglomerate in the Middle East right now. And remember that Rotana symbol. We're going to be coming to that as well later. Rotana, of course, is owned by Prince Al-Walid bin Talal, who's Saudi. He bought the label that was once just a record label and turned it into an amazing vertically integrated media conglomerate. You have Rotana Radio, Rotana Records, Rotana Media Services, magazines, studios, cafes, and at least 7 different satellite TV channels. It's really huge. And they've signed up almost all of the Arab world's biggest popular music stars to this one label. Prince Al-Walid bin Talal, sometimes called the Saudi Warren Buffett. He's leveraged, private stakeholder in the Four Seasons and Apple, and of course into News Corp. And Rupert Murdoch is leveraged into his media holdings as well. And it's not just Rotana. There's been a lot of different plays in the culture space, specifically in the Gulf. For instance, you have the Islamic Art Museum in Doha, Qatar, and there are under development of outposts of the Louvre and the Guggenheim in Abu Dhabi, as well as some other sort of cultural institutions. So it's interesting how that formulation is being challenged by the Gulf. So thank you for allowing me that. That's sort of my quick overview of the media and cultural landscape in the Middle East. So let's move on to sort of the topic of the day. Reflecting on music and protest for someone like myself is sort of an interesting endeavor I found out over the last year. As someone who's passionate about the region, I've really been plugged into all the media that's getting pumped out and sort of been paying attention, and couldn't help but notice how music was being used in the protests. And as a musician, I like to think that music is always going to be doing the right thing, but of course, that's incredibly naive and it's much more complex than that. And I came across a viral video on YouTube that someone had sent me, and that was of the Egyptian superstar Tamer crying after he'd been chased out of Tahrir Square. And this was very interesting to me. What's going on? That sort of was the genesis for this project. Now, Tamer Hosni is often branded the king of Egyptian pop, and he had a great deal of success as both a singer and as an actor after the release of his first album in 2004, Hub, just meaning love. He's one of the top-selling Arabic language artists in the region, and his TV serials during the month of Ramadan do quite well. You can see he's been at Pepsi endorsement deals and everything. I mean, you could sort of call him a Justin Timberlake equivalent, right? That's sort of maybe the closest analogy. And his style is sort of very indicative of the Arabic pop music, the Egyptian pop music landscape. Very schlocky, sentimental love songs, handsome boy, beautiful girl. This Saidi rhythm that you'll hear in this is sort of very indicative, and these very sort of lush string arrangements. So let me just play a really quick clip of this so you can get a flavor for it. Okay, so that doom, doom, doom. Sorry, that Saidi rhythm is such a hallmark of the music industry there. Now, on January 25th, Hosni was actually found himself in Europe in the middle of a European tour, and when the protests broke out, he canceled his subsequent North American tour and came back to Cairo on the 29th of January. He then appeared on a government TV station. He called in to a news program voicing support for Hosni Mubarak. On February 9th, 2011, Hosni appeared on stage in Tahrir Square in Cairo, where the Egyptian protesters had gathered. Now, the protesters grew angry when they saw him and started calling him Tamer Hosni Mubarak. Fun little wordplay on his name. It's sort of initially unclear what his motivations were. By some reports, he intended to apologize for his comments on TV, or maybe to say that he'd been coerced into making the statements. But either way, by some other accounts, he collapsed and had to be escorted, sort of rescued from Tahrir Square by the Egyptian military. Now, this is the cruel reality of the modern world. Both that phone call supporting Mubarak on TV and his subsequent sort of breakdown were preserved on the internet, on YouTube. So that's the first two translations on the handout that hopefully you all aren't sitting on. And then it says, after his visit to Tahrir Square. So it's a really shocking video to see, this huge Egyptian, Arabic language megastar going through this. And I'll just run through these really quick. So the first one, when he's calling in, he says, one person says, why are you not broadcasting the Tahrir Square on your channel like other channels? Well, go away. The other channels have ulterior motives, and sort of specifically speaking about Al Jazeera there. They have their own purposes. Sure, those people shout, no, no, no. We should be shouting, yes. This is the truth. And I am certain tomorrow the whole country will say yes to Mubarak. We will say yes to Mubarak. We will all speak from our hearts. We the people. I can't imagine our destiny in anyone else's hands. And then the sort of, one of him crying. They misunderstood me. They told me to go and talk. I didn't understand any of the stuff. They insisted that you talk? Go talk and make the country happy. And I imagine I was pleasing people by what I said. You mean you were duped? Yes, indeed. And I found out it was wrong. So the combination of these two videos led to a tremendous backlash against Tamer Hosni. And here's just a quick example from a music blog. So kind of a brutal thing. And, the hit has been really severe. Now, since then, he's worked tirelessly to try and rehabilitate his image in the Egyptian public sphere. An example are he's given immense amounts of money to charity, as well as releasing new video clips that sort of paint him as a supporter of the revolution. This clip is another one of Tamer Hosni. The translations it's the first one under music videos. It starts off with a montage of people who were killed during the protest. And I'm just going to play a little bit of this so you can get a feel for it. But stylistically, it's very similar to that other song. So I just wanted to give you a quick feel there. But if you look at the translations once again, very sort of flowery language about, I want to tell you the story about the manhood, nobility, and dignity of the Egyptians, and then sort of commemorating the martyrs. There's not really a real criticism of the previous regime in these lyrics, which is, I think, worth pointing out. Now, shortly before January 25th, Hosni had signed a large contract to star in a Ramadan serial on TV. During the month of Ramadan in the Middle East, that's the big time for these sort of soap operas to come out on TV. Due to his hit in his popularity from all these actions, he was forced to take a big pay cut and sort of renegotiate his contract. They also hastily rewrote the script of the serial. It was called Adam, and was about a Muslim boy falling in love with a Christian woman. Now, Hosni's character dies at the end of this newer version of the script at the hands of Egyptian security forces, which is then shown as being the proximate cause for the January 25th movement. So once again, a bit of a ham-handed attempt to sort of place himself on sort of the right side of history, seeing as he sort of bet on the wrong horse. Now Tamer Hosni was not the only Egyptian star to sort of make this miscalculation. Amr Mustafa is another huge star. He's a composer. He does film work and TV work and singers. And there's a famous video clip, I didn't think it was necessarily worth showing, but where he called into Al Arabiya, which is one of the big competitors to Al Jazeera, yelling at the host about supporting the Tahrir Square people and calling the protesters a fifth column, and angrily hangs up the phone. And he's sort of also been suffered a lot for his very vocal support for the Mubarak regime. Now, Hosni was not even the only one chased out of Tahrir Square. Another huge megastar, Shireen, showed up and was chased out after people started talking about that she had sung at the birthday party of Hosni Mubarak. And just to point it out, here we have this Rotana symbol again, just to show you how prevalent this one media company is in the Arab media landscape. Now, it's been really interesting as someone following this. I did a lot of interviews over Skype, but I've also been able to just look at blogs and different things and interview some of the bloggers. One of the ones is this Hot Arab Music blog. And he was indicative of a broader movement that was a blacklist or sort of boycott movement of these supporters. So I'm just going to read a little bit of his sort of manifesto here. So this is the list of shame for all those Mubarak apologists and sympathizers who have also hated, defamed, or called for the killing of the Tahrir protesters. Sure, before January 25th, there was almost no one who dared to criticize the Egyptian dictator Hosni Mubarak. Now a lot more speak out against him, and a lot more are speaking for change. I've compiled a list of brown-nosed celebrities who are still sticking up to the president and have forgotten the lives that have been lost. Those celebrities need to remember one thing. It's the love of the people who made them celebrities, not the regime. It's the people who form their fan base, not the politicians. Maybe the people were wrong to celebrate such celebrities because these celebrities seem not to appreciate that, and they instead place a bigger value on people in power more than the common people. Those opportunistic jerks want to slow down the momentum, and now after all this, they're coming out talking about the protests and urging Egyptian youth to go home. To these intellectually disabled celebrities, everything good happens in Egypt, it's because Mubarak did it. The bad, he is not the one to blame. I do not get it. No one says that all stars should agree or think alike, but they do not need to bail out a rotten regime. Now here is my list with a link to a story about those Egyptian clowns who are in my shit list. And it's amazing. It compiled a really extensive list of all these celebrities with links to either newspaper articles or YouTube videos showing their support, demonstrating their support for the Mubarak regime. Now, the post-revolutionary environment in other countries has been, similarly complicated, similarly interesting. If you look at the case of Tunisia, on the left here we have Lutfi Bouchnak, who is really a national icon of sort of traditional Tunisian music. He was recently bumped off sort of the national, concert circuit in place of El General, who is the hip-hop artist who's sort of the first hip-hop star to sort of voice the protest movement in Tunisia. So that was a huge sea change that you never could have imagined happening just a year or two ago. Similarly, based in Egypt, the singer Latifa has gotten in a fair amount of hot water. She was seen as a supporter of Ben Ali and received a lot of criticism back in Tunisia for singing about the protest in Egypt before she sung about the protest movement in Tunisia. So sort of, being a little tone deaf. And there were articles like this, as well as a lot in Arabic, is Latifa hiding? There's some great sort of internet rumors about her, including that she was engaged to Hosni Mubarak's son, Alaa. So that was a way to sort of link her to the regime. Even among those who came out very much in favor of the protesters, there was a wide range of responses. You had people like Ali Hajar and Haytham Nabil, who sort of from day one were putting out music videos and songs in support of the protest movements. And you also had someone like Mohammed Munir, who I think is a very interesting case. He cranked out two of the early songs, Baladi and Izay, that were sort of these protest songs. And it's amazing the technology. He was able to record a song, get it produced, make a music video clip in almost real time. I mean, these songs came out within days of the start of the protest movement. Now, he's interesting because some of the people I talked to, via Skype in Egypt saw him almost as a bandwagon jumper. That was sort of one of the sentiments. They don't see him in the same case as Tamer Hosni, but they do see a distinction there. It's also a little different because he's a little older. He's nearing 60 years old. He hasn't had really a hit song in the pop music industry in maybe the last 10 years or so. So these new songs have sort of single-handedly revived his career. And so why don't we just watch one of those? You have the translations are on the screen. So here you can get a feel for one of Mohammed Munir's protest songs. Now, one of my colleagues has done a lot of research into the music industry in Egypt, and she was telling me that some of the music producers and arrangers and violinists that were playing on those Tamer Hosni tracks are the same people that were playing on these tracks. So it's interesting how some of the behind-the-scenes music forces are the same, even though they're sort of coming from different angles. Another interesting case is that of Elisa. Once again, we have the Rotana symbol. It's sort of the omnipresent media company. And she managed to find herself embroiled in almost every element of the Arab Spring. In terms of Egypt, she received a lot of criticism for a quote about Egypt losing wisdom when the protests first started up. And there were rumors that she'd been banned from visiting Egypt again, although those were sort of found to be untrue. As events unfolded in Libya, she was appointed Goodwill Ambassador as a replacement to Aisha Gaddafi, Muammar Gaddafi's daughter, as she sort of got kicked off. And then during an American Idol sort of show called Superstar, Elisa revealed on camera that her mother is of Syrian origin and that she strongly condemns the brutality imposed on the protesters there and called for the resignation of the government of President Bashar al-Assad. She also spoke out really strongly against the idea of blacklists on artists. So it's interesting how one figure sort of found her way connected into all these different parts. And in Lebanon, I have found this really interesting. Some of the really big Lebanese stars have actually come out in favor, unlike Elisa, for the regime of Bashar al-Assad. So here we have Wadi Asafi, Faris Karam, one of the really biggest Debka stars, and Najwa Karam, another icon, a pop star. They've all released statements in support of Bashar al-Assad, which is sort of surprising.
What community are they from?
I'm not really sure. I'd have to think about that. But that's definitely, the sectarian element definitely played a role. Let's see here. And you have a very complicated situation in Syria where, especially early on, some of the protesters were saying, I'm with the protesters, but I also love Bashar, sort of trying to have it both ways. And you had examples like Samuel Zayn, who declared he was going to write a song about the protesters, disappeared for a few days, and then was seen at a pro-government rally. And of course, the working theory there is that the government was able to apply pressure to either him or his family to get him to change his stance. As things heated up in Libya, they don't have quite as big a media industry, but there was a few people there, and they very quickly came out in favor of the protesters. It's interesting how, sort of as the ripple has spread, people have learned from the previous incarnations. Of course, getting back to our friend Tamer Hosni, just when he was sort of starting to get himself on the right side, the internet dug up some old pictures of Hosni having performed for Muammar Gaddafi. So he got another knock to his credibility just when he thought things couldn't get any worse for him. In places like Morocco and Algeria, it's also interesting how a lot of the traditional musicians and hip-hop artists have actually come out in favor of the regimes there. So it's a very complicated matrix that works out differently country by country, both in terms of local cultural elements as well as sort of the chronological learning curve as different countries learn from each other. So let's look a little at some of the post-Tahrir environment, which I think is really interesting. And there has been this move by these big stars to sort of get it right. And one of the biggest is this project called the Bukra Project, which is, I think, really interesting. It's produced by Quincy Jones. Bukra meaning tomorrow, sort of with this connotation of hope in the future. And it's financed by an Emirati businessman. And it's really a superstar collection, about 24 of the Arab world's biggest stars, including Kazem al-Zahar and a bunch of other people. It also features, the long version on YouTube features an introduction by Shakira, and there's a segment in the middle with Akon singing with these Arab stars. So let's just take a quick look at this. You have sort of a very rough translation starting at the bottom of page 1, and I edited together, it's a really long song, it's like 8 minutes long, so I edited together 2 quick little samples, and so you can see. There's Quincy Jones. And there's Tamer Hosni. And there's Akon. And the obligatory children's choir as well. That's a... Okay, so you sort of get the idea there. It's a very sort of campy, but also very apolitical expression. So it's interesting how they're sort of trying to rebrand themselves in this spirit of hope in the future and optimism. But there's really no political critique. There's really no hard-hitting thing. And so some of the people I talked to said, hey, it's okay as a pop song. It didn't really have any of the resonance of some of the other post-Tahrir cultural output. And just as a small footnote, I think this quote is really interesting. This is from the press release that was going out with this thing. Quincy Jones said this at the release. Music will right all the wrongs, Jones said at a press conference in Dubai a day ahead of the track's premiere. Someone once told me, the only thing you need to know when visiting another country is the food, the music, 20 other words of the language. For everything else, we're all the same. Jones said that there was no one event that galvanized the efforts. It was a dream, and we wanted to do something, and it just came about. And I think that's sort of, as much as I love Quincy Jones artistically, he's really, a legendary American icon in the music industry. This sort of shows that project is sort of reflecting the same level of insulation and lack of involvement in daily people's lives. And it's also really interesting that the song is basically recycled. Tevin Campbell released a song produced by Quincy Jones in 1989. It was #1 on the Billboard charts in 1990 called Tomorrow. And it's the exact same melody. And pretty much the lyrics are translated, word for word. So it's kind of interesting how that sort of came about as well. So this didn't really capture, as well-financed, world-class producer, world-class financing. If this didn't really capture the imagination of sort of the post-Tahrir environment for the youth, what did? And I just want to take a quick look at some of those. A really important group to consider is that of Kairoki, and for a number of reasons, I'm going to be touching on them a few times. They released some songs basically in real time. Once again, South Tahrir, the Voice of Freedom, was a big hit for them. Got featured on YouTube and on CNN and Al Jazeera. They got incredible play for it. The band's name is interesting. Even it's a portmanteau of Cairo and karaoke. That's where the name comes from, which I think is kind of cute. And so this album that this was on, this song we'll be playing, Ya Madan, which is Oh the Square, sort of referencing Tahrir Square, came out in November. Within 2 months, it had already gotten over 600,000 views on YouTube, and it was one of the most viewed videos on Facebook. So it's really amazing how it really caught a storm. Here's a quote from one of the members. It was such a strange feeling. Our song was #6 and ranked right below Justin Bieber and Beyonce. How can this be happening? And it really illustrates a shift in the Egyptian music world. Once again, the mega stars and the local and international stars, which once held a monopoly on the airwaves, don't anymore. And we're seeing the emergence of sort of new voices and underground scenes. Another song I wish I could have played for you by the same group, Matlub Zaim, is a refrainless song. It doesn't have a chorus, and it's just basically a job advertisement for the next leader of Egypt. It's a really powerful song, and it's amazing at their performances. The whole crowd can sing along word for word with the song without a refrain. So it really speaks to that. Here's another quote from them. Before the revolution, it was frustrating because we were playing alone, for friends or in the studio. But after the revolution, people wanted to change the standards. It didn't have to be just singing love songs or making a video with a bunch of girls. The members are friends from childhood, and they're from some of the suburbs of Egypt, of Cairo, primarily I think the Ma'adi area. Here's another great quote from an article I read with them. I got fired from everything. College, my work. Fired from everywhere. Music is pretty much my only option. The other interesting thing about this song, which I'm going to be playing, is that it features another singer who was kind of popular in the 1990s, Aida Al-Ayuba. And she's interesting because she stepped away from the music industry because she had gotten sort of conservative, a little more conservative, observant religiously, you could say, and decided that the Egyptian music industry really didn't have a niche for her. So once again, it's interesting to see how new niches, new cracks are emerging for people. So the translations for this are on your handout as well. But I'm going to skip ahead a little just so you can get a feel for it. So it's on YouTube. I really suggest checking out the whole thing. It's just shot beautifully. The song is beautiful. It's really a great thing. But it couldn't be more different from that Quincy Jones Bukra song, right? The lyrics, the sound of it, the feel of it, the way the video was shot, everything about it is sort of very different. And this band has really cemented itself very quickly into sort of a new space in the landscape. Now, not everything has worked out so well for groups in the post-revolution sort of environment. And here's another case that I think is interesting. So on July 27th, Zaid Hamdan of the group Zaid and the Wings was arrested by the Lebanese government. Hamdan announced his arrest via Facebook. "They are persecuting me for defamation for President Suleiman. I don't know until when I'm staying in prison. Please mobilize," he wrote, which I just think is great on Facebook. Hamdan's arrest was ordered following a request from the Interior Minister Marwan Charbel, according to judicial sources, after Lebanon's general security viewed the video of a song created in 2010, of a song that Hamdan wrote and was performing publicly in 2008. So this raises this issue. He wasn't arrested until 2011, the summer of 2011, for a song that was a video that was made in 2010, written in 2008. General Suleiman is the president of Lebanon. It's a song sort of about that. The arrest appears to hinge around the final line of the song in which Hamdan sings, "Go home, General Suleiman." Eventually the charges were dropped, but only after a significant mobilization internationally and an international outcry. So once again, it's interesting how some of the Lebanese government, the forces in power, were trying to sort of head off at the pass anything that could be seen as mobilizing or giving a narrative for mobilization in terms of the political sphere. And this is just a brilliant video clip once again, so I'll just play a little bit of this. You can get a feel for it. It's one of the best sort of ways of, I think, also just seeing the vibrancy of Beirut and all its sort of energy. And it's in English. So once again, I mean, there's so much going on in this video. I think you'd almost write a dissertation on this video alone. It features, capoeira at different parts and all these different influences. The music sonically is really evocative of this sort of Caribbean, dance hall reggae kind of feel. The lyrics are so interesting. It goes, foreign intelligence go home, foreign influence go home, militias go home, and finally General Suleiman go home. So it's this very sort of direct political message coursing through it. Now, there have been other people bringing very direct political messages and also paying an incredibly high price, and I'd just like to touch on one of those really quick. And that's the case of Ibrahim Khashoggi from Syria. He's let's see here. Sorry, I lost my place in my notes. Khashoggi sort of remixed a class of traditional songs that were often used at festivals and at weddings, and added a very overt political dimension. And they work really well as protest songs because of the call and response and the chanting aspect. By July 1st, as protests were gathering in Hama, over 250,000 people were gathering in the city square and chanting these songs along with him. Now, 4 days later, his body was found dumped in the river with a big, open, and bloody wound in his neck where his Adam's apple and vocal cords had been removed. A clear message to those who dare to raise their voice against Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. So I think that corporeal disembodiment of the ability to speak out is so profound in this instance. The last set of translations is this song, and you'll really quickly get a feel for it. It's this sort of call and response format. And some very fun lyrics are going on there too. So you can get a general feel for it. And what I think is amazing is some people now, after he was killed in sort of solidarity protests in places like, I believe, Chicago and in Berlin, have sort of re-performed these songs to speak out for sort of for what had happened, so not let people forget. So there's a lot going on here, right? There's a lot of different voices. There's a lot of motion. There's a lot of countervailing forces, and it's sort of hard to unveil it all, right? There's still the dust is in the air, but I'd like to share some of the reactions of the people that I talked to. A lot of the people I talked to weren't actually all that surprised by the reactions of these Egyptian celebrities. Quote, "Our Egyptian actors or artists in general used to be isolated from public life and the problems of the largest side in Egypt. They used to focus on their affairs. And they shared with me that even today, if a song comes on at a cafe of a Tamer Hosni song, people will get up and change the channel so that he's not there anymore. Others said that it helped to reveal that these actors were idiots. Before, singers could only get away with silly songs, but it's much more difficult now. While some of the hopes of the revolution may take a long time to come to fruition, it's been told to me that the Egyptian music scene is already more democratic. One gentleman compared it to their Seattle moment. So in the 1990s, when the grunge movement sort of upended the American music industry and allowed sort of new sounds to come onto the landscape. And it's not an even distribution. So, right, some of the traditional sort of gatekeepers are still really keeping with the same Tamer Hosni Egyptian pop machine. But they have found enough champions in the media landscape that some of these new voices like karaoke, Black Thema, and other groups are sort of starting to get out. Now, karaoke is also really interesting as a case study from the element of demographics, which I want to touch on as well. And these are sort of some of the points I want to talk about. So I'm going to talk about the youth bulge, the idea of media capitals, national versus regional identity, and the vocabularies of resistance and suppression. Now, as I talked about before, karaoke it was sort of from this like middle class background, and I think that that's important. In the context of the Arab Spring, we keep hearing this thing about the youth bulge, right? 65% of the Middle East and North Africa region is under 30 years old. When you look at the median ages of some of these countries, it's really breathtaking, right? The United States is considered to be a relatively young country, right? And that's the median age is 36.8. You look at Egypt, all the way down to Yemen, 50% of the population is under 16 years old. When we look at the United States as this distribution, we think about all the public policy accommodations we have to make for the baby boomers, right? In terms of Social Security and building enough schools. So here's the baby boomers and the echo boomers, right? So that is having a profound impact on American social policy. Let's look at Egypt in 2011. Wow, right? But we have to look at not just the quantitative numbers, but the qualitative numbers. And there's a specific sort of demographic crunch point that groups like Kairoki, as well as the Egyptian heavy metal scene, which I didn't have time to get into, speaks to. And that's that there's this class of people, their parents are employed, so as young people they had access to education, they had access to the internet, they speak good English, they went to college, they had all these sort of opportunities, but then they graduate into the workforce and there's nothing there for them. They don't have the wasta, they don't have the connections to get jobs, and they don't have enough money to travel overseas. And so I think that a lot, the movements that sort of laid the groundwork for the January 25th movement were also populated with these same people. So the Palestinian Solidarity Movement, the anti-police corruption and brutality movements, and the Egyptian heavy metal scene, which were three very important civil society organizing nodes for the January 25th movement, all sort of are that same population, that same demographic crunch point. So it's interesting how these music scenes can help sort of tip us off to these important social factors. The second point is circling back to what I talked about at the beginning of my talk about this idea of cultural centers of gravity in the Middle East. So we had Cairo and we had Beirut in the emergence of the Gulf. And so Michael Curtin is one scholar I found very interesting in sort of understanding how these centers occur. And we see similar things here, right? Detroit is known for the auto factories, Hollywood is known for TV, Silicon Valley is known for computer stuff. So, industries tend to find efficiencies by concentrating. And we saw similar things happening in Egypt and in Beirut. And the question was, are the hydrocarbon resources of the Gulf states enough to sort of defeat the entrenched advantages of a place like Cairo? And the other thing I throw into the mix now is that the last thing, the sociocultural variation point that Michael Curtin has laid out, has really revitalized in Egypt, right? There's so much cultural capital, there's so much cachet as being part of these revolutions, that's really helped to sort of complicate that equation. I think before, some scholars were starting to see the Gulf as sort of a fait accompli, as being able to take over the media landscape of the Middle East. And I don't think that's necessarily so true anymore because of the Arab Springs. That's an interesting sort of point of it. And just quickly, as I finish up here, the last 2 points. This musical output has also really complicated and enlivened the identity matrix people have in terms of how they formulate their identities of the national and the regional. So in the one sense, people are so proud to be Tunisian because Tunisia did this, but they're also proud of being Tunisia because now of its role as the starters of the Arab Spring, right? So at the same time, being involved in that protest movement has deepened their sense of national identity, but also their regional identity. And I think this is being reflected musically in so many ways too. And the last one is this thing of the vocabularies of resistance and suppression. And as we saw sort of the Arab Spring movement spread and crop up in different cities and in different places, we've seen how sort of a standardized version gets implemented, but people are learning from the previous incarnations. Where are the sources of power? Where are the sources of control? And what can be done both sort of by those who are pro and counter-revolutionary forces, and how music played a really critical role in giving narratives for mobilization, as well as opportunities for the governments to express their power and their ability to sort of implement power on a geographic space. And I'll leave it there. So thank you very much.